Chapter 7. The First Petal. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. The Bhagavad Gita. Blinded by the mass of light beams shining into their faces from the multitude of flashlights, Sam and Frank stood nervously, surrounded by what looked like about 30 heavily armed soldiers. There was no sound except for a single voice, but from the light, they couldn't tell which soldier it was coming from. "Yes, sir. We've got them," the soldier's voice said. There was no audible reply to the soldier's remarks. It was as if they were listening to one side of a phone conversation. He continued, "Just two. What are your orders?" There was an eerie silence after that. The only thing they could hear was the waterfall in the distance beyond the soldiers. Then, the silence was broken yet again by the soldier's voice. "Yes, sir." A single soldier stepped through the wall of riot shields. It was impossible to make out his face with all of the lights behind him. He reached to his hip and pulled out his pistol and shot both Frank and Sam in the head, one time each. There could not have been a more effortless task. There was no hesitation. He did not even think about it. He just shot them. Frank and Sam fell dead to the ground like rag dolls. Their blood splattered on the massive concrete door they emerged from. As they lay there on the ground, the blood from their heads poured out into immense puddles beneath them. It began to soak into their clothes as they lay lifeless. Eventually, Sam's pool of blood made it to the white flower that was still locked tightly in his hand. That flower became soaked in his blood. The soldier again called for orders. The reply he got was to get the flower, dispose of the bodies, and return topside for debriefing. The soldier relayed those orders to his men. As he walked over to Sam's body and reached down to grab the flower, he noticed that Sam's hand was twitching. The soldier shrugged it off, thinking it was probably the remaining impulses of life and electricity leaving his body. He tried to take that flower from his lifeless hand, but was unsuccessful. Even though he was dead, Sam's grip was as rigid as ever. His body began to move just a bit more. First, a twitch of the leg, then a twitch of the arm. The soldier looked directly at the flower. The once pristine white flower became so soaked in Sam's blood that it turned dark red. It was as if it drank the blood from the ground like water. There was not a single spot of white left on it. The soldier stood up and slowly started backing away from the body on the ground. Sam swiftly became more animated. As he miraculously sprung back to life, he stood up and wobbled for a bit. His head was down as he caught his balance and stopped moving completely. At that moment, a single petal of the flower turned to black ash, as though it were set on fire. The petal simply wilted and fell from the flower in the form of black dust. The soldier quickly retreated behind the wall of riot shields and shouted to the other soldiers, "Open fire!" The clicking and clacking of weapons gave way to a barrage of muzzle flashes and ear-piercing gunfire. Hundreds of rounds were fired at Sam's newly reanimated body. Soldiers emptied entire cartridges of bullets, and when the firing stopped, Sam was still standing. Not a single bullet hit him. The red-hot bullets all stopped less than an inch from his body. All the soldiers could see was a silhouette of Sam's body covered in bullets. They just stopped, frozen in time. Only a second or more went by before the soldiers began to shuffle back a step or two. No one had ever seen anything like this. Half of the soldiers there were battle-hardened in Iraq and Afghanistan. Half of those had taken a bullet or seen their buddies die or lose a limb to IEDs. But no one, not one of them, had ever witnessed something like this. Sam took in a very deep breath. On the inhale, his head raised up and dropped backwards as though there were no muscles in his neck. He exhaled, and the bullets that stopped right in front of him retreated by about a foot. Once again, He took in another deep breath, and in between the inhale and exhale, Sam's head snapped to an upright position. His eyes jumped open in a moment of complete focus. They were glowing white, just like the flower was while it was still in its box. Sam's pupils had completely disappeared. He shouted at the top of his lungs. It was so loud that the walls and floors of the landing began to vibrate. The water that came up to the surface of the landing retreated about 2 feet and started to ripple out and create waves away from that landing. The roar shot across the room so violently that it disrupted the flow of the waterfall that Sam and Frank jumped from only moments ago. All of the soldiers grabbed their ears, trying to keep their eardrums from bursting as they stumbled back from the force of sound coming from Sam. The volume of his scream quickly tapered down and stopped, but the echo continued for just a moment. Then, the room once again became silent. Awe and disbelief were running rampant among the soldiers. What they just experienced was so unreal, but nothing could have prepared them for what happened next. Sam took a slight step back with his left foot as if he were adjusting his stance for better balance. He crossed his forearms in front of his face and took in another deep breath. With a second thunderous scream, he uncrossed his arms and flung them backwards with such tremendous force that it sent the bullets that were still hovering in front of him back to where they came at twice the speed. Those without riot shields were torn to shreds. Limbs, blood, and chunks of flesh scattered across the landing like thick beef stew thrown from a huge pot. 12 men died instantly. Many others were left screaming and crying on the ground, writhing in pain and pools of their own blood. Some bled out only seconds later. A few of those that were protected by the riot shields were stunned, shell-shocked, not physically injured, just unable to process the situation at hand. Their buddies were just decimated by a guy that came back to life and threw their bullets back at them. 3 of the 9 men left standing made a dash for the small black door that they came out of. Sam was quick. He anticipated their attempt to flee and stopped it. With a quick skip step to his right side, he kicked a car-sized boulder and forced it to slide towards the door, not only blocking their escape, but crushing and killing the 3 soldiers in the process. The boulder made a thunderous grinding sound as it slid across that concrete floor. One of the remaining 6 began firing on Sam with his pistol. One shot made a connection with his left shoulder. The other hit his right forearm. Neither of the 2 bullets broke the skin. Sam's attention snapped to the soldier that was taking pot shots at him. Moving so fast that he left streaks behind him, Sam charged towards the soldier and stopped mere inches from him. That soldier was hit by a blast of wind so strong that it rocked his balance a bit. He was left blank with fear. He was standing face to face with the scariest thing he had ever seen. A man that moved faster than he could see. A man that bullets didn't seem to faze. A man that was nothing like a man at all. Sam leaned in ever so slightly and growled as the soldier stumbled backwards in fear. Unable to cope and unable to think of anything else but his own life, that soldier raised his pistol to shoot again. He fired off 2 shots. Sam dodged them effortlessly and grabbed that soldier's wrist. With the ferocity of a starving lion, he ripped the man's arm from his body. There was a grotesque sound of bone cracking and tendon snapping as a massive splatter of blood sprayed the soldiers beside him. With a swift pirouette, Sam turned and smacked the soldier with his own severed arm. It was as if he were hitting a home run with a baseball bat. The soldier rocketed across the massive room, slamming into the wall only feet from the waterfall. Immediately after hitting the soldier, Sam sped after him, running across the water like a hovercraft, and then up the wall like a lizard to meet the soldier when he impacted. Sam stood straight up on the wall as though it were the floor. He reared back his fist and smashed the soldier's head before gravity could take hold and pull him down to the water, which was about 15 feet below. The punch was swift and devastating. Sam's fist traveled all the way through the soldier's Kevlar helmet and into the wall, creating a crater in the concrete. The soldier's body separated from his now pulverized head at the neck and splashed down in the water below. The 5 remaining soldiers split up and quickly headed for cover behind one of the massive boulders that surrounded the large concrete door. In rapid and random patterns, they started firing rounds at the beast of a man that Sam had changed into. A flurry of those bullets pelted his skin, creating little ripples as they made contact. None of them made it through the skin into his body. Sam raised his hands and forearms in front of his face and turned his head to the side as though he were being splashed in the face with water. Annoyed once again, he sped into action, running parallel to the pool of water along the wall. Shards of brick and bits of concrete were flying off of the wall behind him in a trail of dust. As he traveled, one of the soldiers fired a grenade from the launcher mounted to the bottom of his gun. Without hesitation, Sam stopped dead in his tracks and caught that grenade with one hand, like a baseball. He crushed it in his hand and caused it to detonate. The explosion was massive and blew pieces off of the wall in football-sized chunks that rained down into the water. The entire area around him was covered in dust and smoke so thick that no one could see if the shot was effective. Sam exploded from the smoke, flying headfirst like a rocket at the dispersed band of horrified soldiers. Smashing into the ground in front of them, the force of his impact rippled across the small landing, breaking apart the concrete as it traveled away from him. He let out another furious scream. Gripped by fear, the soldiers did the only thing their training would allow them to do. They opened fire again. This time, the bullets didn't even get close to Sam. They simply veered off course before they got to him. It was as if his will was extending beyond his body and told the bullets where to go. The soldiers didn't stand a chance. Sam took one step forward and then another, and midway through his third step, he exploded into a sprint that was so fast the soldiers lost sight of him. All they could see were the bits of concrete flying up in the wake of his movement. As if by magic, he appeared in front of the first 2 soldiers with his hands around their necks. Sam squeezed his hands and pulled out their throats as easily as a person opening a cabinet door. Dropping the fistfuls of destroyed tissue and muscle, he took hold of their bodies by grabbing a hold of their rib cages, and with a quick spin, sent them flying through the air towards the 3 remaining soldiers. One body landed on the boulder that those soldiers were using for cover. Blood splattered from the remnants of the body onto their faces. The other landed only a few feet behind them. With blood all over his face, one of the 3 remaining soldiers kept saying, "This shit ain't real, man, this shit ain't real." He repeated it over and over like some horrified mantra. Staring at the body that lay on the rock in front of him, he didn't notice that Sam had zipped up behind him. Sam placed his hand on the back of his head and smashed it into the boulder. Caught completely off guard, the soldier next to him spun and began firing on Sam at point-blank range. Even this close, the ridiculous little bullets had no effect. Grabbing the fully automatic rifle by the barrel, Sam tore it from his hands. Raising the gun back over his shoulder, he brought it down to the soldier as if he were swinging a machete and embedded it into the man's skull. From 30 to 1, as the blood of 29 of his companions spilled into the massive pool of water that was beginning to turn red, the last soldier cowered behind a rock. Deep in prayer and shaking violently, he did not raise his weapon. He simply buried his forehead into the backside of his thumbs, hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles were white. He sat and he prayed. He prayed that this beast would not take him. He prayed that he would get to see his family again. He thought of nothing but his wife and 2 little girls. Sam landed on the boulder he was hiding behind. He would not move. continued to pray. Sam shouted like a wild beast, claiming dominion over his territory. The soldier just clenched his eyes shut tighter and fought back the tears. He was not afraid of his death. It was the thought of leaving his children without their father and the pain it would bring to his wife that scared him. This monster was simply a means to that end. Sam reached down and grabbed the back of the soldier's body armor, lifting him up off the ground. That soldier struggled for a moment. He accepted his fate, and he was not struggling from fright or fear, but more from discomfort. Dragging him like a child dragging its teddy bear, Sam hopped from the top of the boulder to the ground. Turning his gaze upward to the ceiling, he crouched down somewhat and jumped upwards with rocket-like speed. As he reached the roof, he raised his fist and smashed through the brittle concrete. His punch was focused and powerful enough to break through the many layers of dirt, rock, and pipe that lay above the room. It was only a moment or so until the massive explosion of rock and dirt blew through the asphalt of the city street above. Chunks of rock the size of furniture leaped from underneath the ground by the dozens. They flew some 30 feet into the air and crashed back down onto the ground, smashing cars and going through the windows of shops that lined the street. People began screaming as they scattered like roaches. The sound of tires screeching and cars smashing into one another filled the air as they stopped to avoid the concrete and asphalt chaos that was raining down from the sky. Alarms were blaring off of all of the parked cars as they were crushed by falling stone.